You want money to go home?
Oh, yeah.
He seems to have lost his way.
Money to go home. I'm a stranger in a sea.
Welcome in this new retrospective on one of the most famous and most talented South Korean actor, that is Ahn Sung-ki. Why do a video about a retrospective specifically about Ahn Sung-ki, who is, despite being a star in its native South Korea, is actually fairly unknown outside of the peninsula. But for this very reason, actually, because he is indeed almost completely unknown outside of South Korea, and I think that's almost criminal, because he is someone who has worked extensively for more than 60 years, so he has a huge filmography. He is a very talented actor, and he has made many great films, which for many of them are as unknown as him. So that's the concept of this channel, that's the DNA of this channel, to try to talk about subjects which are not necessarily covered elsewhere. So I thought it was important to raise awareness about his work through this video, and maybe contribute to my small level to make him more famous and being seen as the great actor, the great star that he is. There is also another reason for which I chose Ahn Sung-ki. As I said, he has a more than 60 years career behind him, and that means he started at the end of the 50s and is still active nowadays. So thanks to him, we can cover a very wide spectrum of films and see the evolutions of South Korean cinema on several decades. I will be able, through this retrospective, to talk about South Korean film from the 50s, 60s, 70s, a little bit less unfortunately, but 80s, 90s, and that's something I actually like to do. If you have seen already the video about South Korean cinema fans who seem to be unable to dig further than after the 2000s, that's something I like to put some light on, that is South Korean cinema before the 2000s, before 2000 actually. And so this retrospective talking about Ahn Sung-ki's career is a way for me to once again put more light on this cinema, on this huge number of films which have been made before the IU, the big boom of the South Korean culture in general in the world. And so that's why I wanted to do it as well. As we will see, that won't necessarily mean that we are going to talk only about great films. There will be great films in this retrospective, and there will be also quite a few bad ones, but I think that's emblematic of what South Korean cinema was doing in these decades before 2000, and so that's interesting to study and to talk a bit about it, in my opinion. Last little comment before I start. You have to be aware that Ahn Sung-ki has been extremely active. He has done many films, and despite all my best efforts, I haven't been able to watch everything he has done. So there will be some big holes in his filmography and in this retrospective, especially for the 70s. I think I've seen almost none of the things he has done for the 70s. So that's really there is really something missing. It's a bit like Sonny Shiba's retrospective. Even if I managed to cover more than 60 something films, there are still many more he had done and which I hadn't been able to see and then to discuss in the video. So that will be the same here with Ahn Sung-ki. Sometimes I will go from 1 year to like 3 or 4 years later. That doesn't mean he hasn't done anything between this gap. It just means I haven't been able to track and see these films with any kind of subtitles. So that's it. You have the reason why I decided to do a retrospective on Ahn Sung-ki. So now we can start. And we will start by a film from 1959, which is Sister's Garden, directed by Shin Sang-ok. Shin Sang-ok is really the big boss of South Korean cinema from the second half of the 50s until the end of the 60s. He was someone with a very acute business sense. He was really able to create an empire, a cinematographic empire in South Korea around that time, using some using some political connections, creating some connections also with other companies outside of South Korea. He did quite a few collaborations with the Shaw Brothers, for example. But he was also a very talented filmmaker in his own right. He was able to touch to many different genres, and he usually did it with a sense of originality. He was trying to do things a bit differently. He was trying to, of course, cater to the taste of the South Korean audience of the time, because that's what he had to do as a producer, as the owner of a film company. But at the same time, he was trying to put a bit of originality and to have his own artistic voice in those films. And that's the case in Sister's Garden, which is a melodrama. The concept of Sister's Garden is fairly simple. We have two sisters and their little brother, and their father, who is a doctor, suddenly dies from an illness. And so they have to fend for themselves. They have to survive, try to find jobs, and it's especially difficult because they are burdened by the debt that the father had toward their house, and so they have to find ways to survive and to be able to pay this debt. So very simple, very classic, melodramatic concept there, but what it makes Sister's Garden is interesting is the way Shin Sang-ok plays with this concept. In a normal melodrama, this idea that they have to pay for the house would be the main storyline from the beginning to the end. They would have to suffer a lot in order to achieve that. But actually with Sister's Garden, that's not the way it is. Shin Sang-ok is doing a melodrama with a different stage. So this plot point is actually solved fairly quickly in the story, like at 1/3 of the movie. And then it moves to some other to some other problems that they have to face. And that's really a quality actually for the film, because this way we are always surprised and we are always curious about what is going to happen to those characters and to the story in general. So that's really a good point for Sister's Garden, in my opinion. At the same time, while it is a melodrama and so we see the characters suffer, most of the characters which are in the film are not that simplistic, I would say. They are a mix of they are a bit more grey and more positive character. In melodrama, you usually have people who are really horrible, who are really taking advantage of the weakness of our heroes. There is a little bit of that there, but actually many characters around them are trying to help them as well. So it's a more optimistic and positive melodrama compared to the more hardcore melodrama which could be made around that time, be it in South Korea or elsewhere actually. And I found it a good thing because that made it made for an easier watch compared to some of those super sad melodrama. And so that makes that, once again, that was a good point to the benefit of the film. So I would say Sister's Garden is a pretty good example of the kind of film you could expect from South Korea during that time, during the end of the 50s. and it's actually a good representative. I mean, it's a good one. So I would advise you, if you want to discover other kind of South Korean films, if you are ready to really go in time and see movies in black and white, see another aspect of the South Korean cinema production, this movie is a good way to do this first step in this direction. And that's also a good way to be acquainted to Shin Sang-ok. He did many other films, and he did better ones, but this one is a good entrance door in a way to his filmography, in my opinion. And where is Ahn Sung-ki in this story? Actually, Ahn Sung-ki is playing the little brother of the two sisters, so he's very young. He must be like 6-7 years old, and that's an interesting thing. So Ahn Sung-ki, before being the star that he would become in the 80s, was a child actor. He is decent there, but it's hard to really notice that he would become such a big star. It's not like Bruce Lee. If you watch Bruce Lee's film when he was a child, you already find some mannerisms, some reactions, which are exactly what he would do 20 years later when he would do kung fu films as an adult. And you already see he has some kind of star quality there. While I really like Ahn Sung-ki, I cannot say the same thing here. He is doing a good job. He is convincing. He is not one of those annoying child that there may be in many films. But at the same time, it's very hard to imagine that he would become such a big actor. So decent, but nothing more when it comes to Ahn Sung-ki's performance. And you will notice that's what I'm going to say for most of the film he did as a child actor. So that will be the case in the 3 to 4 films coming in this retrospective. A second film of this retrospective, it's a classic, considered as one of the most influential South Korean film of that time, and that's The Housemaid, directed by Kim Ki-young. The Housemaid has been remade several times. It's a movie from which Parasite, Bong Joon-ho's Parasite, drew a lot, and it's usually considered by most of the South Korean critics to be maybe the greatest masterpiece of South Korean cinema, something like that. It's very highly valued, basically. So when you watch this kind of films, you always have a bit of apprehensions, a bit of fear, because you are not sure what you are going to get. That's the same when you are watching something like Citizen Kane or Metropolis, those kind of films which are so highly valued that you don't know if you are going to appreciate it as much as those critics, or if you will just feel like that was a scam. And when it comes to The Housemaid, as far as I'm concerned, I'm a bit reserved toward this film. Kim Ki-young is an interesting director from that time period in South Korea. That's someone who was not as overtly commercial as Shin Sang-ok. He was really trying to bring some kind of maturity in his films, to touch some subjects which were not necessarily that mainstream, which were quite critical of South Korean society. So he is an interesting director for his intentions and for his ambitions. But I must confess that quite often, I haven't seen his whole filmography yet, but quite often I find him a bit lacking in execution. And that's exactly what happens on The Housemaid, as far as I'm concerned. The Housemaid is a very simple story. We have a family, a relatively bourgeois family from Seoul in the early 60s, and they hire a housemaid because they are quite well off, and so that's the normal thing to do for them. The husband is working on bringing some money, the wife is the perfect housewife, so she doesn't work, as it should be in Korean society back then. And so they have to also embrace some kind of traditional Korean values, and at the same time with a little bit of Western progress. So they represent this kind of new bourgeois class which was developing in South Korea around that time. And so they hire a housemaid, and this housemaid is actually a bit devious, and she's going to manipulate them in order to take the place of the wife, to get rid of the kids, and to become the new wife of this piano teacher, this husband and father with a piano teacher. So that's the concept, and through this idea, through this concept, what Kim Ki-young is doing is it's a critique of this kind of superficial values that a segment of South Korean society was having, the importance of face, the importance of reputation. Basically, the main characters are unable to act against the manipulations of the housemaid, because that would show them in a negative light to others and to the society. So they are kind of slave to this concept, and that's why they end up suffering from her. And at the same time, you have also a class struggle thing with the housemaid, which is more poor, which comes from a poorer background, and so she's trying to elevate herself socially and from a class point of view. So there is also this kind of elements of critique of what was happening in South Korea around that time. All these concepts are actually interesting. You also have quite a bit of sexuality on display, because the main weapon of this housemaid in her quest to get rid of the other member of the family is her sexuality. And that's something which was not that usual in South Korean cinema during the 50s and the 60s. So all this is interesting to analyze and to see from an intellectual point of view. And the first half of the film is actually quite well done. You have a good setup for the situation. You have a good introduction to the characters. The black and white is quite nice, and the direction is fairly smooth as well. So everything at the beginning is really interesting, but once the manipulation of the housemaid are really going full reign, I find it very hard to believe what is happening there. You really need to have a very strong suspension of disbelief, because it's one thing when she's trying to manipulate and to get them to have doubt about themselves and things like this, or to manipulate the children. That I can buy into it. But once it becomes so serious that you have people dying, sorry, that's a spoiler there. But once you go that far, the reputation, the face should not be things which come into play anymore when you reach such a level. And the normal reaction anybody would have would be to denounce this housemaid or to kick her away, and that's it. And the characters are paralyzed, and at this point I find it very hard that they would be so paralyzed because of these fears of the reputation and the way the society would look at them. And so that's a big problem for me to buy into the second half of the film. And so I watched the second half of the film with a lot of skepticism, basically, and that is a real problem for me. And that's interesting to notice that it is the kind of problem I also have with Parasite. During the second half of Parasite, I find it very hard to keep the suspension of disbelief about some of the actions of the characters, about the fact that there is a guy who has been living underground the house, and with the guy who is lighting the light once the bourgeois are coming back to their own place. That's a problem which is often coming back in those kind of South Korean films to me. But so yeah, that's why I have difficulty to see the housemaid as the classic that many South Korean critics argue it is. At the same time, we have Ahn Sung-ki playing the younger kid of the house. Same comment as what I did for Sister's Garden. I think he does a good job. He's not irritating. He has a bit more to do in this one compared to Sister's Garden, but at the end of the day, you don't really have a performance which is that impressive and which would make you think that he was going to become such a big star. And he's a bit outshined also by the character of the sister. He has an elder sister in the film, and not necessarily because the elder sister gives a much better performance than him, but because she's handicapped. And just this fact attracts our attention more than on her than on him. So yeah, good, solid performance for a child actor. That was Ahn Sung-ki back then, but same conclusion as for Sister's Garden. And for a film which I think you need to watch if you are interested in South Korean cinema, because as I said, he is considered as one of the greatest classics, so it's interesting to watch and to make your own opinion. But be aware that there are some people like me who consider it to be slightly overrated. We move to the year 1961 with a movie called My Sister is a Tomboy, also known as My Sister is a Hussy, directed by Han Yong-mo. My Sister is a Tomboy is a mix of romantic comedy with a bit of social commentary. The main character is a young girl who is an expert in judo. She's so good at it that she can basically beat any man who tries to come at her. And she's single, which is a problem in South Korean society in the early 60s. She's single for way too long, and so her father and society in general is trying to press her to find a man for herself and to get married. And so we will follow this girl in a quest for a husband. She's going to interview several people, and then she, at the middle of the movie, she's finally going to get married. But the big problem which comes into the film for her is that she is too stubborn. She's too stubborn. She tends to look down on men, and that's a real problem in our South Korean society of the time. And so you have basically two parts in the film. The first part is the romantic comedy part, as I said, when she's trying to look for a good husband material, and so she sees different men. And this part is actually quite well done. There are some funny scenes there and there with the way she interviews those men and what they are trying to achieve on their side, what are their intentions behind meeting and marrying this girl. You also have some nice shots of Seoul in the 60s when the city was starting to develop after having been rebuilt from the Korean War. That was only like 7-8 years before that Seoul had been completely destroyed during the Korean War. So that's interesting to see how things were back then. The black and white is actually quite nice in this one. So the first half of the film is okay, I would say, quite entertaining. Things go a bit more complicated once we reach the half point of the film, when she finally gets married, and the problems move to the fact that she's not a good wife. She's not following what she should be as a housewife in South Korea, which is basically obeying her husband's orders, doing him a breakfast, this kind of very trivial things which she is supposed to do if she wants to be an ideal South Korean wife. And the climax of these problems in the film comes when the husband, after she has refused to do something for her husband wants to give her a smack want to smack her face, and she used her judo to counteract it, and so it's not able to do it, and he ends up on the floor, and that's a big problem. That's the thing she should not have done. And then the rest of the movie, everybody is going to criticize her for not having taken the hit, for being so spoiled, for not being a loyal wife. And as you can imagine, it's something which hasn't aged very well. I think it's actually quite awful to look at it now. But at the same time, that's in line with the cultural values that were at play in South Korea around that time. So from a cultural and sociological point of view, it's interesting to see, but as an audience, it can be quite painful. And if, as me, you can be quite critical about the very paternalistic vision that South Korea has and has had for centuries, then it's a bit painful to see how this girl is being shamed, and how they are all pushing her to become basically a completely submissive. I find it quite horrible, to be honest. At the same time, to be fair, she's clearly shown as being someone who is far from perfect. She's a bit bad-tempered. So she certainly has flaws which needs to be corrected, but still, the idea is that the paternalistic values have to be followed, and she has to become submissive. And that's a message which obviously I have a lot of difficulty with. So that makes for a kind of a difficult viewing, especially during the second half of the film, in my opinion. And that's too bad, because it could have been a bit, if it was less conservative, less retrograde, maybe we could have had a pleasant romantic comedy with a slight social commentary about the evolution of South Korean society. But obviously Ahn Young-mo chose to side with the neo-Confucianist values very strongly, and that makes it for not a super enjoyable viewing, in my opinion. Ahn Sung-ki is playing the little brother of the main sisters. Nothing much as usual to say here. Solid, decent performance, but nothing outstanding. For a film which I'm not sure I can really advise you to watch it. If you are interested to see the evolution of South Korea society, I think that could be interesting. But if you just want an entertaining, interesting film by itself, I would not necessarily advise you to watch this My Sister is a Tomboy. We stay in the year 1961 with another movie by Ahn Young-mo, and so be ready. You are going to get another dose of very conservative values with this one, which is The Dream of Fortune. In A Dream of Fortune, we follow a couple with their little boy, played by Ahn Sung-ki. This couple is having financial difficulties. The husband has a job, but is not super well paid, and there is a real housing crisis in South Korea around that time, which is actually quite an interesting thing to discover, these kind of issues which were at play in South Korea around that time. That's one of the things which the film is interesting to watch for, in my opinion, if you are interested in the evolution of South Korean society around that time. And so the wife is pushing very strongly her husband to earn more money. The husband is indeed a little bit lazy. He's not the most responsible guy ever. When he has some friends coming at home, he goes into a drinking spree, wasting a lot of money. So she has a point in pushing him, but still the idea of the film, the moral of the film is that you should not try to do more than what you have in life. You should not try to change your position in life, and that's basically what the wife is trying to do. And they are going to be in trouble when they will meet some American Korean guy who is doing some kind of traffic with the American army and who is proposing them to invest in his business. Obviously it's a scam, and so they are going to end up losing their money by associating with this guy. And in the same way as My Sister is a Tomboy, the first half of the film is more like a comedy. The way the main characters, the husband and the wife, are quarreling, and the different people they meet during their interactions is dealt in a fairly light way, and things are going to get more serious during the second half, even actually the last third of the film, once they realize that it's a scam, and then it goes full melodrama, and almost too much full melodrama actually, because it gets very cruel at the end for these characters. In my opinion, almost too cruel. The fact that they kind of lose all their saving and their money, I think, is already a punishment enough for their actions. But no, the director Ahn Young-mo, he really goes one step further in order to make it even sadder, even stronger. But I think it's a bit out of place. And so this movie keeps the same spirit as My Sister is a Tomboy, by trying to promote some very conservative values of just work hard, stay in your place, and don't do anything more than that, which once again I have some reservation about. That's not exactly the kind of values I believe in. And so that leads to the same kind of conclusion as My Sister is a Tomboy, that you can watch the film because it's interesting from a sociological point of view, it's interesting from an historical point of view, to have a snapshot of South Korean spirit around that time, but that doesn't make it for a very pleasant or entertaining film to watch, in my opinion. And that's basically it for Ahn Sung-ki as a child actor. He will keep working as a child actor until 67, and then he will come back in the film industry in 1977 as an adult. But the first film I've seen of him as an adult is from 1980, and it's a movie called A Windy But Pleasant Day, directed by Lee Jang-ho. Lee Jang-ho, that's basically one of the biggest commercial director in South Korea during the 80s, and as we will see, that's a decade in South Korean cinema where you had a few famous directors, and Ahn Sung-ki basically was their main actor in many times, and that's the case here in A Windy But Pleasant Day, in which we follow three friends who are trying to survive in Seoul. They are not the brightest, they are doing some odd jobs or small jobs, and they are trying to survive and to make it in the big city, and it's difficult, and they will also encounter some kind of love, but not necessarily the best love they could find. They will, in the case of Ahn Sung-ki, is going to fall in love with a girl who is obviously from a much higher social background, who is a bit westernized, and who is kind of going to play with him because she finds him a bit stupid, and so that's not going to be the most the most healthy relationship he could have. And that's a similar situation with the two other friends. With A Windy and Pleasant Day, we have once again a mix of comedy and drama, more on the comedy side during the first half and more on the dramatic side in the second half, same as with the Dream of Fortune. It's a movie which once again is more interesting from what you can see of the evolution of South Korean society rather than for its entertaining qualities. What is interesting there is that we are following some small characters, some blue-collar characters, and clearly we can see the evolution that South Korean society was experiencing with the economic boom that was taking place in there. We have many buildings being built in Seoul. We have a visual way of expressing this evolution of South Korea back then, and that's interesting to see. And the fact that Lee Jang-ho decided to be on his character, his blue-collar characters, is a way to show that this economic boom was not necessarily benefiting from everybody in South Korean society back then. And so from this point of view, the film is quite interesting to watch. But as a comedy, as a melodrama, it's not that convincing. The comedy part is not very well inspired, and when it comes to the drama, it's basically using the same kind of narrative device that were used in South Korean melodrama from the decades earlier, from the 70s, from the 60s. And so it doesn't feel fresh or new or original, and it's a bit expected, it's a bit predictable on many aspects. And so it's a bit frustrating, because you see that the way he put things in place, there was a potential. It could lead to a really good film, but it's just not going one or two steps further, allowing the film to really be free from the usual tropes of this kind of South Korean films, from the usual formula which had been set earlier. And so that's really too bad. Having said that, there are a few scenes which are interesting and actually quite funny. There is a scene, for example, with Ahn Sung-ki in a club trying to impress this westernized modern girl by dancing, and in order to be able to dance, he's thinking about the shaman from his village, the kind of dance that they were doing. And so we do the same thing in this environment, in this very symbol of modernity, and that's quite funny, and Ahn Sung-ki really goes for it, so that gives a quite entertaining scene there. And so there are some there and there, but as a whole that remains a bit disappointing and a bit laborious, a bit strained for most of the part, and yeah, that's frustrating. Basically, it's a bit of a frustrating film. I also think that the way Lee Jang-ho described the main characters is a bit clumsy. I think he's really making them too stupid, too naive. Of course, that's the concept of the film, that they this kind of characters have to face this new society, but still they are a bit too simplistic. I think there should be a bit more of an evolution in them during these encounters with these different girls, and I think it's a bit heavy-handed with the way the characters are being shown, and that's once again a flaw for the film, despite having some good actors, and in this case despite having Ahn Sung-ki with giving a solid performance, but I don't think he's helped by the way that the character is written, and so it's not his best performance in my opinion. He did much better, and we will see some films in which he was much more convincing. But that's interesting though, to see him as the young boy, a young adult, and this kind of film is going to be his trademark. He's not going to be in the most light-hearted films. He's going to be actually involved in films which are trying to make comments about South Korean cinema, about South Korean society of the time, and so that's interesting, and that's the first step in this direction. This windy but pleasant day. It's not completely convincing, but they will build from there, and they will achieve better things with the following films. Now we move to the year 1981 with Mandala, directed by Im Kwon-taek. If you have seen my video about Im Kwon-taek, this video about Im Kwon-taek was actually the very first I did for the channel, and so obviously I'm a big fan of the director. I think to this day he is the very best South Korean director ever. And so obviously Mandala is a film I really like. I already advised you to watch it in those 5 Im Kwon-taek films I recommended. So once again, I'm going to recommend it, and I'm going to give it a lot of praise. Mandala is about 2 Buddhist monks. One of them is played by Ahn Sung-ki. He is coming out from a difficult personal relationship, a love story which didn't end up well, and so he is in a lot of doubt about life in general, and so that's why he embraces Buddhism. And then he meets another monk who has a very different and personal take on Buddhism. Is basically trying to experience life to the fullest by eating forbidden dishes. As when you are Buddhist, you are not supposed to eat meat. That's the case for him. He's eating meat. He's having a sexual relationship with girls and all these kind of things. And so he is going to encounter this guy, and he's going to be fascinated by his approach of Buddhism, and so he's going to follow him for a while, and they are going to meet each other at different stage of their life. Mandala is basically a spiritual road movie on feet, which is quite an original way of handling things, which is quite an original concept, and that really but it's very fitted for the material which Im Kwon-taek is playing with. So we have a lot of shots of the characters walking from one place to the other, and I think they're actually beautiful. I really love when Im Kwon-taek is doing this kind of shots. There is a bit of the King Wu spirit, in my opinion, and that's a good way also to put in perspective the characters in their quest for a sense in the world, and so we are seeing them in this environment, in this nature, and that put it into perspective of what is really our place in the world and our values. And so I think those kind of shots and this kind of moments in Im Kwon-taek film, when the people are moving from one place to another, are actually very important to set the mood of the film, and they are beautifully shot as well. As with a good but windy day, we also have many opportunities to see the evolution of South Korean society around that time, so there is also a bit of commentary about that. But as usual with Im Kwon-taek, he's not really taking a specific stance. He's not trying to be someone very moralistic. He's just showing you how things are being changed, how things are evolving, and it lets you reach your own conclusion, which is something I much prefer a filmmaker to do, rather than the one who have a very definite idea about things, how things should be, like we have seen with Ahn Young-mo on A Dream of Fortune, or My Sister is a Tomboy. I must also say that I'm not someone who is very spiritual or religious. I'm actually quite anti-religious on many aspects, but I still found Mandala interesting to watch, because I think it brings some legitimate questions about Buddhism and the way you can try to become a better person, when the way you can try to evolve as a human, as an individual. And so despite me not being religious in any way, I found the film interesting to watch, and the different thematics that it was bringing to the table were interesting to think about. And so that's a very good point for the movie, in my opinion. And if you are like me, if you are not someone very spiritual, I would still advise you to watch it. You still have some interesting things to think about watching Mandala. And Ahn Sung-ki is really great in his part of Bob Woon, this monk, this Buddhist monk who is full of doubt. He really managed to show the different facets of his character, the curiosity, the doubt that he has about his faith or about the behavior of his monk friend. All these kind of things. There is really a lot of development and evolution in his character, and he's really able to portray them in its full range. So, in my opinion, Mandala is one of the very first best performance from Ahn Sung-ki. So clearly, you should check Mandala. Im Kwon-taek, Ahn Sung-ki, both really showing their talent. Not exactly for the first time. You already had some glimpse of what they could do in the previous film they did, but that really comes together for the first time with Mandala. And so yeah, it's a must see. Good film, very good film, very good performance by Ahn Sung-ki. So a must watch if you want to continue in this quest for good South Korean films. Still in 1981, we have another film which is also interesting, with a very mysterious title, as it is The Ball Shot by a Midget, directed by Lee Won-se. The Ball Shot by a Midget, that's the story of a dwarf, a midget, who is the father of several children, who was a circus artist. But the circus has closed its door, and so he has to come back to his house to find back his wife and his children. But he doesn't want to be. He's already quite old, but he doesn't want to be a burden for any of his relatives, and so he's trying to look for a new job, and he's going to end up being a doorman for an hostess club. And what is interesting with the ball shot by a midget, it's its original concept. It's actually an adaptation from a book, and the dwarf main character here, all his wife is a normal person. She has the normal size, and his children are the same. They have the normal size. So he's the only one who is with a dwarf, and so. You have a lot of questions about what it is to be different in society, all the pressure that you have, all the shame that society is going to put on you with people making fun of you because you are different, because here in this case you are a dwarf. And that's something which is actually quite courageous, I think, from Lee Won-se to do a film about such a concept, because indeed when it comes to cinema, when it comes to dwarf, little people tend to be used for films which are set in a fantasy world or in science fiction. I don't know if you have seen, I think the title is Living in Oblivion by Tom DiCillo, in which you have a director who is using a dwarf because he wants to do a scene which is a bit Lynch style, so a bit of fantastic aspect, and you have the dwarf who complains that they only are being used this way when it comes to films. And the ball shot by the midget really made me think of that, and this complaint is exactly right. For whatever reason, cinema doesn't use dwarf in a normal way. They don't show them as normal human beings who wants to have their own place in society, who want to integrate and who have feelings like everybody else. And that's something which the film here is trying to put in perspective, and I think that's a very good thing to do. And so here we can see all the difficulty that this very upstanding man is facing because he is a dwarf, and that's quite touching actually. And especially it's especially touching because at the same time he has some very a strong relationship with his wife, but also with his children. The main children, the early son that he has is played by Ahn Sung-ki, and there is a bit of a guilt in Ahn Sung-ki because he wasn't able to become socially better, to become someone, to elevate himself in the social status of Korea at that time, and he's also feeling very bad about the way his father is treated by other people around. So he has a kind of a burden of guilt on him, but at the same time we have some discussion, some scenes between the father and the son where they are really able to express the love they have for each other, and it's really touching. It's really touching, those scenes. I really like them, and just for that I think because we are able to, because the concept of the film is courageous and is worthy, and because we have some well-fleshed characters which are really shown in their complete humanity, I think The Ball Shot by a Midget is a recommended film, and you should watching. It's worth the effort. At the same time, I cannot say that it is a masterpiece. The film has its flaws. I think it's a bit too long. It's a bit grey in its photography, a bit dull in its photography. I would have preferred something a bit more, a photography a bit more rich than what is being shown there. It has a bit of a TV quality sometimes, which is understandable, but as the movie probably didn't have a high budget, but still that could be better. Also in the last third or second half of the film, it goes a bit too much into the old school melodrama that South Korean cinema was doing during the 60s and 70s, and so once again we have some clunky narrative device there, which I think doesn't really make the film better. So yeah, not a perfect film. Some flaws there and there, but the concept is courageous, and we have some very good performance from the actors and from Ahn Sung-ki, and we have some touching moments. So I would still advise you to watch the Ball Shot by a Midget. I think it's worth the effort. It won't be all the time that pleasant, but you will be touched, and you will have things to think about after watching the film. So yeah, I would still say it's a recommended film and an interesting film in Ahn Sung-ki's filmography. We move to the year 1982 with People of the Slum, directed by Bae Chung-ho. So we already saw Lee Jung-ho with A Windy but Pleasant Day, and Bae Chung-ho is basically one of the other big directors of South Korean cinema during that time, and one of the most interesting one. And he's going to work extensively with Ahn Sung-ki, so there will be many films from Bae Chung-ho we will talk about. And in the case of People of the Slum, it's an adaptation from a book which was a very big success in South Korea, and it was something Bae Chung-ho had really to work hard to produce, to shoot, and to get released in South Korean theaters, because as you can expect from its subject, which is some people living in a slum, that's not the most flattering of South Korean society we can find, and so that led to a lot of problems with the censorship back then, because South Korea was still a dictatorship back then, a military dictatorship, and it was still under a strong censorship system. And so Bae Chung-ho had to do many change, many cuts, but he still managed to deliver, I'm not sure I can say a masterpiece, but a very good, very strong film with, once again, a social commentary, once again, a melodrama. So that's really something which was very popular in South Korean cinema during these decades from the 50s until the 80s. But this one is one of the best representative in my opinion. So we follow a woman who is living in the slum with her son, She's in couple with a taxi driver, and the relationship is a bit strained, is a bit difficult, but anyway they are helping each other, and they are living there, trying to make the best of the situation and the opportunities they have. And their life is going to be changed when the ex-husband of this woman is going to appear, someone who has left her for many years and who didn't see his son for all these years as well. The son who thinks that his father had left. And so that's going to be a big new thing in their life, this apparition from this ex-husband father. He is played by Han Sung-ki, of course. So there are two facets in People of the Slum which I think are really well done. The first is the description which is given of this slum. It's not something which is overly moralistic, and you see those different people living there trying to make the best of the situation, who are sometimes bickering with each other, but we have also some moments where they are laughing, where they are happy. And so you have a description of this place, of these people, which have several layers. It's not simplistic, it's not overly melodramatic, it's full-fleshed. In my opinion, you really have the wide range of individuality, of characters, of human beings which you can believe in and which you can relate to in some aspect. And so that's really a good positive point for People of the Slum, especially as the direction and the photography of Bae Chang-ho is on point. It's actually quite vibrant when it comes to the colors. We escape from this dull photography that many South Korean films of that period had, and I think that really helps to make the film more interesting to see visually. And we also have an interesting description of South Korea at the time, which is really well showcased by this kind of landscape, this landscape in evolution in Seoul. And so that's very well coached by Bae Chang-ho in his direction, and that makes it for an interesting background. But at the same time, the core of the film and what makes it that successful is, of course, the characters, and especially the three characters, four if we count the little child, which are in the story. And the story is really touching, quite sentimental, of course, but realistic at the same time. And the one who is really the standout, well, I mean, they are all good. They all give very good and solid performances. I tend to prefer Han Sung-ki's performance, but the other actors really are at very high level as well. But I really like the way Han Sung-ki portrays his character. You see that he's really burdened, once a bit like in the ball shot by a midget, burdened by what he has done. He wants to do good for his ex-wife and for his son, but he knows that he is guilty of not having treated them correctly back then before, and so he has to deal with that. He has to accept that, and he has to confront that when he's dealing with his child, when he's dealing with his ex-wife. And it's an heavy burden, and he's really able to portray that extremely convincingly. You have also some nice moments when he's finally able to be with his child, but he doesn't dare to tell him who he is actually. And so that all these aspects are really well made. Also between the ex-husband and the new boyfriend of the wife, there are some interesting relationship which is evolving, which is not one-sided or black and white, and so that all these characters are really human and well portrayed, well described by Bae Chang-ho and by their respective actors. And as I said, you also have this background of the evolution of South Korean society with those people who are not necessarily benefiting from the economic boom. So all this makes it for a very interesting melodrama with social commentary, for a very good film, basically, which you should watch. That's another must, in my opinion, of this South Korean cinema of the 80s. You had Mandala, you have a ball shot by Midget despite its flaws, and you have these People of the Slums, a really good film, which is kind of forgotten. I think that the South Korean critic, the South Korean film historians know its value, and they try to put it forward. That has been the case for the Korean Film Archive, but it's a movie which is not that known outside of that, certainly not by most of the South Korean cinema fans. So I really advise you to go watch it. It's easy to access, as it is on the Korean Film Archive YouTube channel, as it is the case for most of the film I'm discussing in this video. So please try to do the effort, go for it. I think you won't be disappointed. We move to the year 1983 with Village in the Mist, another film directed by Im Kwon-taek. Village in the Mist is part of almost a subgenre of South Korean cinema, which was kind of popular during the 70s, which are movies about female characters who end up in an environment which is completely foreign for them, be it an island, be it a village in the mountain, as it is the case here. And by being in this completely different environment from what they are used, they are going to discover their deeper frustrations and desire, and they will turn to they will become and they will become different character at the end of this journey. You had several films like this. You had Night Journey by Kim Soo-young. You had Yodo by Kim Ki-young, all made in the 70s. And I'm not very fond of this kind of films, to be honest, but I found Village in the Mist to be one of the very best, and the reason is, of course, the presence behind the camera of Im Kwon-taek. For many reasons. One of the reasons is that Im Kwon-taek is able to capture this village in the mist beautifully. Is really able to get some. Is really able to capture some very evocative shots of the place, and it creates an atmosphere which is really fascinating. Almost fantastical, and that's where I think he is really superior to the other directors who have done this kind of films, and so that makes it for a very intriguing film to watch from this point of view of the atmosphere. He's also able to rely on his on this mix of image, and is also able to combine with music in order to enhance this atmosphere. Sometimes actually some surprising musical choice. You have a bit of a pop disco song at some point, but it actually works very well. It creates a very interesting atmosphere, and so this capacity of Im Kwon-taek as a director to be able to create this kind of atmosphere is really to the benefit of the film, is really to the benefit of Village in the Mist. At the same time, we have characters which are a bit more developed, I think, than it is the norm with this kind of subgenre. The character of the main character is actually, I think I haven't given you a brief sum up of the story. It's actually a young teacher from the city who is being sent to this isolated village in the mountain of South Korea, and it's the first time she's there, the first time she has to do this job, and she's going to encounter a beggar who is going to open a door in feelings. She's going to feel both attracted and repulsed by this guy, and so that will open a door in her own desire and frustration through this character who is of course played by Han Sung-ki. And so, as I said, with Imquantech, we have characters which are more developed. I think the way the actress in the movie is showing their emotions is more convincing. So Imquantech is certainly part of the equation to make it more interesting. The actress herself is also giving a very good performance, and so we are more interested in the evolution of personality, of desire, how she becomes, how she assumes better her desire, her femininity. It's something which I find more convincing in Village in the Mist compared to the other movie of this subgenre which I already mentioned. Ahn Sung-ki being this character a bit out of the normal society, is a bit on the margin, and that's also the occasion for Imquantech to give some kind of comment about society in general, the way people treat this kind of characters who are out of the norm, and that's actually quite interesting. He shows some of the ugly side of uniformized society, of a society which has its very clear norms, and so how they deal with this kind of people who are out of the norm, and that's interesting also to watch. And Ahn Sung-ki is playing the character in a very wide spectrum of emotions. He's either very restrained in his emotions or he's going all out. So it's a very wide palette of emotions that he's giving here, and he's doing it quite well. It really helps to. He's really able to be convincing as the source of this conflicting emotions for the teacher character, for this young girl. And so, yeah, solid performance, good film. This Village in the Mist. The only flaw, in my opinion, is that it may be up slightly too long, not by much, very slightly, and it's a bit too explicative at the end. It's really trying to explain you directly what you have seen before, and that's really a shame. It's not a good idea from Imquantech on that. I'm not sure, maybe that's his producer who asked to have it. Usually he's more subtle than that, so I'm guessing that was not his choice. But yeah, there is a long voiceover at the very end of the film in order to explain you what you have seen, and that's not needed. I think you already had reached your own conclusion, and it was pretty obvious already. And it's good that you have still a room to think and to make your own interpretation of what you saw. So this explanation at the end of the film is not to its benefit, but it's not a big problem either. That's not going to transform the film into a dud. It's still a good Imquantech film. It's good, a solid performance from all the actors and from Ahn Sung-ki. So obviously another film you should check and you should watch. And the last film of 1983, it's Flower on the Equator, directed once again by Bae Chang-ho. In my opinion, Flower on the Equator is one of those hidden gems of pre-2000 South Korean cinema. Hidden gem because, of course, it's a very good film. That's the first criteria for this adjective to be fitted. But also because it's a movie which is completely under the radar. We have talked about some films which are not necessarily that famous, but films like Kim Ki-young's The Handmaiden or several of the Imquantech films we have talked about, they are at least a bit known, so there is some awareness of their existence, and there are some articles, there are a few reviews you can find on the internet, so they are a bit known at the very least. But Flower on the Equator, there is almost nothing on it. It's a movie which is completely under the radar, as I said, and I think it's a real shame because, as I said, I think it's a hidden gem. It's a very good film. What is the story of Flower on the Equator? We have Ahn Sung-ki playing a salaryman, a basic employee in a South Korean company during the the early 80s, so 83. He's living in one of those huge residential complex, a bit like public housing, but a bit more fancy. But this kind of big building with a lot of flats at each level. And one day he sees on one of those similar residential complex, but the one in front of him, he sees his neighbor with a beautiful girl, and then he will start to get kind of obsessed about her. And what is great about Flower on the Equator is that from the beginning to the very end, we are never sure what we are seeing there. Are we witnessing a nice little romantic comedy where Han Sung-ki is in love with his neighbor and he will finally be able to reveal to her his emotions and it's going to be a nice happy ending? Or is it actually a psychopath thriller? Is he actually so obsessed with her that he's completely getting crazy and is going to do something horrible to her? And from the beginning to the very end, Bae Chang-ho managed to keep that aspect of the movie completely mysterious. We never really know for sure what we are watching, what is going to happen next. Clearly there is some kind of feelings that Han Sung-ki has for his neighbor, but is he a psychopath or is he just someone who is unable to express his feelings? The movie managed to keep the question mark until the very end, and that's really something very impressive, because at the same time you are never bored or you are not annoyed by the thing. You are just amazed that you are always kept wondering, kept in the dark so masterfully. And Bae Chang-ho, of course, deserves a lot of credit for managing to stay at the border of each genre and never cross one side or the other. But also, of course, the actors, and obviously Han Sung-ki deserves a huge credit for that. He really is able to keep also the character ambiguous from the beginning to the end. We never know what he's really thinking, how he's really feeling, and so that's really a joy to watch. I really like the film. Maybe it helped that when I saw it I knew nothing about it, so I was completely unprepared, and so I was, I guess, in the best mental condition in order to watch it. Maybe if I'm telling you, if you watch the movie after having seen my short review there, maybe you will appreciate it a bit less, but still I still believe that it's one of those hidden gem of pre-2000 South Korean cinema, and so you should really check it. I really think it's also a very good performance of Han Sung-ki. Maybe not his very best of that time. Maybe it's more in some of the in context film he did, or People from the Slum. It can be argued, but anyway, he delivers a very good performance in any case, and so for me it is a must-see in Han Sung-ki's filmography. The year after, 1984, Han Sung-ki works again with director Bae Chang-ho for The Well Hunter. Well Hunter, it's the story of three people. The main guy is a young student who ends up being sent in jail, and in the jail he meets a beggar, a flamboyant, extravagant beggar, which he's going to follow, and through him is going to kind of get into some weird adventure. During these adventures they will meet the third character from this trio, who is a mute prostitute, and so all of them, those people who are a bit at the margin of the society in a way, they are going to encounter different funny situations, sometimes dramatic as well, and they will evolve on becoming a better person, or at least in the case of the young student entering the adult age. It's this kind of coming of age story. Well Hunter is, as it has been the case in some of the previous films we have talked about, it's always mixing drama and comedy. The comedy is mostly offered through the character of Han Sung-ki, this very colorful beggar. And Han Sung-ki is a joy to watch in this one. He's really going all out with his character. He's really playing it as extravagantly as it should be, and so that gives for a mini situation which are indeed quite funny. There is one in which he's trying to scam some tourists, and so he speaks in English and stuff. It's a very funny scene, and there are quite a few well made throughout the film. There is a real evolution in the character, and so we are able to really relate and feel invested in what is going to happen to them. At the same time, we have quite a beautiful photography, actually, quite colorful. I tend to prefer this kind of photography personally. I'm not too fond of the TV movie, a bit grey, dull photography that some of the Korean film had in the 70s or early 80s, but this one is quite colorful, and I really appreciate that, especially as we have some nice shots of Seoul in the early 80s. It's always something which I enjoy to see in these older films. At some point the characters also go in the countryside, and they are in the countryside during the winter, so a lot of snow, and it creates an interesting contrast with what we saw before when they were in Seoul, and that makes for very nice landscapes and some nice scenes which are more atmospheric, more relying on the beautiful landscape and the music at the same time, rather than the dialogues, the characters talking, and so that makes for some very nice cinematographic moments. So Well Hunter is a good film. It's a recommended film for sure. At the same time, it seems a bit unclear about what is really the message the film wants to put forward. There is a bit this idea of a coming-of-age story, as I said, which is at the heart of the film through the main character, this small student. Seems to try to have a bit more than that, to have some kind of political message about what you are supposed to do when you are a grown-up, once you are an adult, and there is a bit of an opposition with the authority in the film, but it's a bit unclear what he really wants to say about that, which can be understandable given the high censorship there was back then, but that muddy a bit the movie, in my opinion. And if it had a clearer stance politically wise, I think it would have made the film even better. It's also a bit too long, and I think if there has been also a bit more of subtlety in the drama sometimes, that could have been more interesting. It's that the problem is it's a similar problem as we had in some of the other films we have talked about in this retrospective, that sometimes they tend to keep following the old school melodrama devices, narrative devices, and there is a little bit of that, not too much, but if he had managed to get rid of them, I think Bae Chang-ho would have ended up with a more mature and more interesting film from the beginning to the end. That's not enough to make of Well Hunter a bad film. It's still a good film from this period of South Korean cinema, and it's still a recommended film, but as in the other case, you can feel there was maybe potential for something even better than what we have at the end, and so there is a slight frustration watching the film, and not a complete pleasure, not a complete satisfaction. But still, as I said, recommended movie. Try to check it out, especially if you like Ahn Sung-ki, because Ahn Sung-ki has a very good performance as this very eccentric character, very eccentric beggar. We stick to the year 1984 with Between the Knees, directed by Lee Jang-ho. Between the Knee is a weird animal. It's a movie I actually really like, but the message it has is extremely controversial, and I'm actually very critical of it, and I'm going to explain why. So in Between the Knees, we follow a young lady who is unable to control her desire. She has some sexual pulsions. She wants to develop some relationships. She wants to be able to discover her desire, but she's unable to control herself, and men tend to abuse of that constantly, and so she's always either abused, either bullied, so she's always in a tough spot. And we will discover throughout the film why she has this problem. She basically has a trauma that she's carrying from the very beginning of the film through some flashbacks until we have the realization near the end of the film. It is a drama, it is a character portrait, a female character portrait. It is also an erotic film, and you have to be aware that during the 1980s there was a strong policy from the government to do erotic film. Back then South Korea was still under a military dictatorship, which was not popular at all, especially after stuff like the Gwangju massacre. And so the power in place was aware of its unpopularity and was trying very hard to try to entertain the mass, entertain the population. And so they really pushed a lot the popularity of sport and when it comes to cinema of eroticism. So there were many erotic films produced in South Korea during the decades of the 1980s, and Between the Knees is one of them. And on that aspect, it's actually a pretty good one. I think Lee Jang-ho really manages to show his actress in a very exciting way without being too vulgar or without going into a pornography, but she is shown in a very desirable way with a real talent when it comes to the photography and the camera work or the framing. So that's really to the benefit of the film. I think that's an important criteria to be able to do some nice erotic scenes when you are doing an erotic movie, and also because the main actress is of course a very good looking girl. But there is more than that. There is a real message, as I said, and the message is the part which is the most controversial in Between the Knees. I'm going to do a spoiler there, otherwise I won't be able to talk about it. So if you don't want to discover anything, skip for several minutes until I finished. But the trauma that the girl has its origin in the abuse by a Western teacher when she was just a little child. And it's because of the abuse she has been a victim when she was a child that she's unable to have a healthy sexuality when she is an adult. So what's controversial in that? Actually not much. That's a scenario which is completely possible. But the problem is that there are a lot of signal given by Lee Jang-ho throughout the film that is basically attacking Western culture, and is basically saying that Western culture has corrupted Korea. That's the idea. You have, of course, this main trauma from the main character, but you have also a lot of other things. You have the brother of the main girl who is a big fan of Michael Jackson and is always listening to Michael Jackson doing some breakdance, and because of that is unable to communicate with his family. You have a lot of symbols of this Western corruption throughout the film, through the music, through some symbols of soft drink or of other things like that. And that's clearly the message that Lee Jang-ho is trying to put forward. It's not really subtle. I think anybody will catch it pretty quickly that that's the idea that he is putting forward, especially given the character of Ahn Sung-ki, who is a very traditional South Korean man. He's always, not always, but he's often wearing traditional clothes. He's interested into traditional culture, traditional practices, and he's very stable. And it's through him, through this stability, that the girl will be able to overcome, at least partially, the trauma that she has inherited from the abuse by this Western teacher. And I find it very dubious. I find it very critical, this message from Between the Knees, because while you can certainly criticize many aspects of the Western culture and the way it has been implemented in South Korea, to put the whole blame of the corruption of society, of the bad evolution of South Korean society on the Western influence is very narrow-minded and very simplistic. There is nothing about the very paternalistic tradition that South Korean society has known for centuries, or its high conservatism, the place of women in the old time of South Korea. And it completely forgets that actually the Western influence came into South Korea pretty late, because for a long time it was really the hermit kingdom. It was really not that open to a Western influence, and so that was a really recent phenomenon. And I think if you want to blame the Western culture, there are certainly ways to do it, but just put it as a blanket like it's the source for all the evil that South Korean society is experiencing around that time, I think it's highly simplistic. So on that aspect, I don't think the movie is very well done, but despite this problem in the messaging, I still think Between the Knee is an enjoyable film, because it's a good erotic drama with a character who is interesting to follow. There is a really nice photography and a really nice direction from Lee Jang-ho. He managed to have it a bit constructed like a Dario Argento giallo. I want to say this trauma that she is carrying, it's a bit like the revelation of what happened in Deep Red, Profondo Rosso, when the character is trying to remember or discovering the trauma that the killer had. So there is a bit of this kind of construction, and there are actually a few scenes which are a bit horror oriented, with a real well made work on the atmosphere. And so I really think that the movie has many qualities. It's just too bad that it didn't bring a more subtle message about the evolution of South Korean society. Still enjoyable enough, still good performances from all the cast. Ahn Sung-ki, as I said, as this very traditional South Korean man who is very good for this kind of part. He's always, when he has a bit of his authority figure, that's something we will find much more, of course, when he will grow older, but he was already pretty good doing that in 1984. And the rest of the cast is also great, and as I say, there are many qualities in the film. Not so much on the message, but still very interesting to watch, and in a way things to think about and to meditate about. Yeah, so it's still a recommended viewing in my book. We move to the year 1985 with another film directed by Bae Chung-ho, which is The Deep Blue Night. Deep Blue Night, it's the South Korean version of Green Card, the film directed by Peter Weir with Andy McDowell and Gérard Depardieu, but made much earlier. And while Green Card was a bit of a comedy and love story drama, Deep Blue Night is much more oriented on the drama. There is not much comedy there. We follow two South Korean in LA. That's actually one of the very first South Korean films to have been shot in the US outside of South Korea. Back then that was not that usual. And so Ahn Sung-ki is a young immigrant, a fresh immigrant, fresh off the boat, and who tried to make a living in Los Angeles in order to earn money, to send it to his family, and at the end, if possible, to have his family coming to the US. And in order to achieve that, he's going to have a fake wedding with a girl from South Korea originally, but who is already got the American nationality. She has been married to a black American, and they have a daughter together. But still, she's not in the best situation. I mean, her relationship with her former husband is not very good. She's a bit lost, and so she's going to enter with this fake wedding with Ahn Sung-ki. And these two kind of lost characters are going to exchange, to share their loneliness in a way. even if that's not going to be a very harmonious relation anyway. I say that the movie is reminiscent of Green Card, and that's certainly true. But I want to put another parallel with another film from Asia, and that is from Hong Kong. And I'm thinking here of Farewell China. Farewell China, that was the quest of Tony Leung Kar-fai for his girlfriend, played by Maggie Cheung in the US. And it was proposing a very dark vision of the US from an immigrant point of view. And that's the same we have here in The Deep Blue Night. It's a very dark portrait of the US. And I think there are actually similar causes. And that's quite fascinating when you look at it. Farewell China was made in 1990, just after the Tiananmen Square massacre. And this pain felt by the director, who was Clara Lowe back then, is really obvious in the film she made, and that infused, and that makes for a very dark, almost unpleasant film. And I think that's the same with The Deep Blue Night, except that in this case that the reason, I think, was the Gwangju massacre. So the Gwangju massacre and all this kind of horrible thing which happened during the first half of the 80s to the final achievement of democracy in South Korea, all this trauma, all these horrible things which were happening back then. And I think that's the same. It infused Deep Blue Night as well, and that makes for a similar result, a film which is very dark, very depressive in a way, and unfortunately, that also led to the same failure, because Farewell China, in my opinion, despite having some heart in a way, is not a good film. It's a bit messy in what it tries to say. It's over the top when it comes to the description of the environment in the US, and I think the Deep Blue Night actually suffer exactly from the same flaws. It's just too much to describe in a way which is really too simplistic and too one-dimensional. And it's especially obvious if you look at the character played by Han Sung-ki. He's actually not a nice guy at all. He's kind of a dick. Just in the first few scenes at the very beginning, we see him with a girl in the desert, and he starts beating her up, and then he takes his money and he just leaves her in the desert like this, probably to die. And that's our hero. And I think it's way too much. I'm all for characters which are 2, 3, 4 dimensional, which are not simplistic, which are not all nice, that they have a bit of gray, that they are a bit complicated. I actually enjoy that, and I'm all for it. But in this case, the guy is mostly an asshole most of the time, so you don't really want to root for him. You don't really want him to manage to overcome the obstacles he has to face being in a foreign land, and so that makes for a fairly unpleasant film. And also we have a lot of dialogues in English, which makes sense, as we are about with immigrants being in the US. They have to speak English, and it's part of the difficulty they are facing. So it's good that they kept that and they didn't try to dub everything in South Korean. But Han Sung-ki and his partner are not too great when it comes to the English, and some of the dialogues are very awkward, and that really doesn't help to elevate the film one level higher. It sounds awkward many times. So this Deep Blue Night, it's really a tough nut to crack. It's not a pleasant film. You once again, you see that there are some interesting intentions. There is something in there under the surface, under this shell of depression. There is certainly some interesting comments about South Korean society, its relationship with the US, the difficulty of being an immigrant in a new environment. All this is there, but it's not dealt the best way to make for a stimulating, intellectually stimulating experience, or just a pleasant entertainment. And so at the end you end up not necessarily depressed, but you are not going to have a good time, and you are not going to be really joyful after watching this Deep Blue Night, which is for me another frustrating and disappointing experience. And the last film from the first part of this Han Sung-ki's retrospective is Lee Jang-ho's Baseball Team, directed by Lee Jang-ho in 1986. Obviously, it's a sport movie about a team of baseball. It's an adaptation of a manhwa, so the Korean manga, the Korean comic book, which was very popular. And you can also see through the title of the film that back then Lee Jang-ho was really one of the very top director in South Korean cinema. That's, as far as I know, that's the only time you have a director was its name in the title. So that really says something about his star power in a way, as a director at least. And so adaptation of a manhwa, a very classic sport film when it comes to the structure. We have several characters who are a bit in difficulty, who are not able to really achieve their full potential, but they are going to be in the same team, and they are going to finally able to complete each other's and to overcome what was their problem before through this work as a team. And so they will finally manage to go to the top of the sport in which they are practicing, which is baseball. Baseball being one of the #1 sport in South Korea. That's certainly the Western influence, the American influence, as our friend Lee Jang-ho already said in a very critical way, but he's much less critical here. He seems to really enjoy baseball. So makes you wonder about what he really wanted to say with Between the Knees. Anyway, so if you have checked some of my previous video, I already talked about this kind of sport film in my recommendation for Japanese films or some other retrospective. I think it's a almost bulletproof formula if you just apply it seriously with enough care. You will always end up with something which is at least watchable and pleasant. And the first half of Lee Jang-ho's Baseball Team seems to fit this criteria. It's really a good introduction, a good setting up of the main character, a good build-up. It really follows the classic rules of this kind of film. We have Han Sung-ki playing the trainer, the very tough trainer, very cruel by many traits, by many of his actions, which is kind of in line with the spirit of manga. A lot of those sport manga, they have this kind of character, the tough at the exterior trainer, but who actually is doing it who has the best interest of his student at art. So it's a bit like this with Han Sung-ki. He's also handicapped, so that gives him a bit of a gimmick, a visual gimmick at least. And so he's really good in that. Great performance by Han Sung-ki. But so the first half, quite good. You think, okay, that's going to work. But then in the second half comes the big problem of the film, which is its tone. It's all over the place. It doesn't really know what it wants to do. The first half is fairly realistic, dealt in a serious way, but then at the middle point, our characters are sent to an isolated island in order to train to become better, and then it gets completely crazy. It gets like in a manga that they start to carry some huge trunk on their back and run for hours. I mean, it's like completely insane. And if this tone had been chosen from the start, I mean, why not? If it was a bit like Shaolin Soccer or the sport film like this, why not? There is no problem if it had set like this from the very beginning. But as it had been treated until then quite seriously, like a serious sport drama, it's completely out of place, and you really wonder what is happening there. And there are a lot of these tonal problem throughout the film, and I'm especially thinking about one specific character who is black, but the actor playing him is not black. He's an Asian actor, he's a South Korean actor having a black face. And at first you wonder, is he really supposed to be a black, or is he actually a South Korean guy who is having this identity problem, and so he's putting, there is some kind of defensive mechanism there, or some kind of trauma, whatever. And I was really wondering if at some point there would be some kind of reveal, a payoff about why this guy has a black face. But actually no, he's really supposed to be a black actor, a black character, and so it's very cringy to see him in each scenes. I mean, it really pulled the film down a lot. I don't know really what happened there. I guess the director preferred to use a South Korean actor rather than look for a black actor. But I think that's a big problem in the film. And as there are already this tonal problem as well, it makes for once again a frustrating experience, fairly unpleasant. It's not that bad. At the end of the day, you can still find some enjoyable moments there and there. As I said, those kind of sport films, they always work, and most of the time Lee Jang-ho kind of follow the formula, so it's not that unpleasant to watch. But sometimes you will be wondering what the fuck is happening, or what the fuck is this character, and that really doesn't help to make the film a success. So it's a mixed bag when it comes to Lee Jang-ho, a baseball team. I would still give it a slight recommendation for Han Seung-ki's performance, which I really liked. But yeah, be aware that it's not going to be all great from the very beginning to the end. And that's it. That's the last film for this first part of this Han Seung-ki's retrospective. As you can see, we have already covered some a wide spectrum of films, some really good ones, like People in a Slum, like the In Quantek, like Flower on the Equator. Many mediocre ones, or films which had potential but which doesn't really manage to fulfill it fully, so quite frustrating experiences. But with the second part of this retrospective, we will see some very good films. We are going to raise in quality with each retrospective, even if maybe the second part may arguably have the very best film of Han Seung-ki's filmography, but that's arguable. But still, I think and I hope that you have discovered many films which you will be curious to watch. Almost all of them are available on the Korean Film Archives channel, and I'm going to put the link in the description, so you really have no excuse not to watch those films. Go check at least a few of them, the one which seems the most interesting for you based on what I said, and I can almost guarantee you that you will learn new things. You will see a new aspects of South Korean cinema, and maybe enjoy some new emotions watching those films. So go ahead, watch those films, and I will see you very soon on the second part of this Han Seung-ki's retrospective. Until then, take care.